Help me? Little boy writes on $1 at a gas station. What the biker does next will shock you. The sun had not fully risen yet when Tommy Parker opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment, staring up at the ceiling. There was a brown water stain above his bed, shaped like a lopsided heart. He had memorized every edge of it over the past several months. It was the first thing he saw every morning. It was the last thing he saw every night. He listened for sounds in the house. Nothing. Just the low hum of the old refrigerator down the hall and the wind pushing against the thin walls. Jake was already gone. Tommy knew without even checking. On Saturday mornings, Jake left before the sun came up to work his shift at the warehouse on Route 9. Then he would drive across town to bus tables at the diner until close. He would not be home until after dark. He would smell like grease and sweat and exhaustion, and he would ruffle Tommy's hair and say something like, "How's my guy?" even though his eyes were already half closed. Tommy loved his brother more than anything, but the house felt very empty on Saturday mornings. He pulled back the thin blanket and sat up. The floor was cold under his bare feet. He padded down the hallway to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator out of habit, even though he already knew what was inside. A carton of milk, some leftover rice in a bowl covered with plastic wrap, a half-eaten sleeve of crackers on the top shelf where Jake kept the snacks. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He closed the door. On the kitchen table, held down by a coffee mug, was a small stack of envelopes. Tommy had learned to recognize them over the last few months. The red lettering across the front of most of them. Words like "final notice" and "past due," printed in bold. Jake never left those out on purpose. He probably forgot them there the night before when he was too tired to think straight. Tommy straightened the stack carefully and set the mug back on top. He stood there for a second, just looking at them. His chest felt heavy in that quiet way it sometimes did. Not a crying kind of heavy, just the kind that settled in and stayed. He got dressed, pulling on his jeans and his favorite blue hoodie with the small hole in the left cuff. He laced up his sneakers and grabbed the $1 bill he had been saving from the change Jake left on the counter for him each week. Jake always left something. Even when there was almost nothing left, Jake always left something. Tommy folded the dollar carefully and put it in his front pocket. Outside, the morning air was cool and sharp. The sky had turned a pale gray and orange above the tree line. Tommy wheeled his bicycle out from beside the porch steps, the front tire bumping softly over a patch of cracked concrete. He pedaled down the road. The town was quiet this early. A dog barked somewhere far off. A truck rumbled past on the main road without slowing down. Tommy kept his eyes forward and his hands steady on the grips. He thought about his mom. He did that a lot lately. He would catch himself doing it in the middle of things. In the middle of eating. In the middle of trying to fall asleep. She had been gone for months now, and nobody had given him a real answer about where she went or why. Jake always got a tight, careful look on his face when Tommy brought her up, like he was trying to hold something together from the inside. Tommy had stopped asking out loud, but he never stopped wondering. Maybe she had just left. Maybe things got too hard and she walked away from all of it, from the bills and the broken porch railing and the brown stain on the ceiling. Maybe she walked away from him. He pushed that thought down hard as the gas station came into view up ahead. Beecher's Fill and Go sat at the edge of town, where the main road curved left toward the highway. It was a small, worn-looking place with 2 old gas pumps out front and a hand-painted sign in the window that said, "Open." A little bell above the door chimed whenever someone walked in. The parking lot was mostly empty this early, just an old sedan parked crooked near the air pump. Tommy leaned his bike against the side of the building and went inside. The woman behind the counter was Edith. She had white hair pinned back loosely and round glasses that sat low on her nose. She looked up when Tommy came in and gave him a small nod. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Tommy said quietly. He walked to the snack aisle and studied the options for a moment, the way he always did, even though he already knew what he could afford. He picked up a small bag of peanut butter crackers. 69 cents. He had done the math before he even left the house. He carried the crackers to the counter. Edith began ringing them up without a word. She was not a chatty person in the mornings. Tommy appreciated that about her. While she turned to get his change, Tommy stood very still. Something had been building inside him all morning, all week, really, maybe longer than that. It was the heaviness from the kitchen table and the empty house, and the wondering. It was the thing he could not say out loud to Jake because Jake already carried so much. It was the feeling of being invisible, in a way that had nothing to do with anyone actually seeing him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dollar bill. He stared at it. Then, very quietly, he reached across the counter and picked up the short pencil that sat beside the receipt holder, the kind of small eraser-worn pencil that gas stations always seem to have. His hand moved quickly. 2 small words across the face of the bill, pressed in careful, slightly uneven letters. "Help me." He set the pencil back. Edith turned around and set his change on the counter, a quarter and a nickel and a penny. Tommy slipped the coins into his pocket and picked up his crackers. The dollar bill stayed on the counter where Edith had left it, facing up, waiting to be placed in the register with all the others. Tommy did not look back at it. He pushed through the glass door, the little bell chiming once above his head, and walked out into the morning light. He climbed onto his bicycle, tucked the crackers into the front pocket of his hoodie, and began pedaling home. He did not know why he had done it exactly. It was a strange thing to do, a small and probably useless thing. But somewhere in the back of his mind was a quiet, fragile little hope. Maybe someone would see it. Maybe someone would care enough to ask. The bell above the door chimed again about 10 minutes later. Edith looked up from the counter where she had been sorting receipts. She went still for just a moment. The man who walked in was large. Not just tall, but wide through the shoulders, built like someone who had spent a lifetime doing hard things with his body. He wore a black leather vest over a dark, long-sleeved shirt, and the vest had a patch on the back that Edith recognized without needing to read it. His arms were covered in tattoos that climbed all the way up his neck. His face was rough and weathered, framed by a dark beard going gray at the edges. He moved slowly and deliberately, like a man who had never once felt the need to rush for anyone. A few other customers glanced over and looked away fast. Edith did not look away. She watched him walk straight to the coffee station near the back wall. He pulled a large cup from the stack, filled it without hesitating, and snapped a lid on top. Then he turned and walked to the counter. He set the cup down and pulled out his wallet. "Just the coffee?" he said. His voice was low and even. $2.15, Edith said. He handed her a $5 bill. She counted back his change and set it on the counter beside his cup. 2 ones, 3 quarters, a dime. He scooped up the change without looking at it and dropped it into his vest pocket. Then he picked up his coffee. He was about to turn and leave when something stopped him. His eyes dropped back down to the counter. His hand came out of his pocket slowly. He set the change back down and spread it out flat, one piece at a time. Then he reached over and picked up the dollar bill that was still lying there, the one Tommy had left. He turned it over once, then back again. He stared at it. A smirk moved across his face at first. Just a small one, like he was looking at a joke. But then the smirk faded. He tilted the bill slightly under the fluorescent light above the counter. His eyes moved across the small, careful letters pressed into the paper. Help me. He did not say anything for a long moment. Edith watched him without making it obvious she was watching. He set the bill back down on the counter, very flat and very deliberate, like he was handling something that mattered. "The kid," he said. Edith looked at him over her glasses. "Pardon?" "There was a kid in here before me." He glanced toward the door, and then back at her. "Small, blue hoodie, came in on a bicycle?" Edith studied him carefully. "What about him? He write this?" She looked at the dollar bill. She had not noticed the writing before. She leaned forward and read the two small words, and something shifted quietly in her chest. "I didn't see him write anything," she said honestly. Mason looked at the bill again. He did not touch it this time. "He come in here often?" he asked. Edith considered the question. She considered the man asking it. She had spent 40 years running this station and watching people walk through that door, and she had gotten fairly good at reading them. "Every Saturday," she said. "Regular as a clock, always by himself, always polite." She paused. "Always looks like he's carrying something a little too heavy for a boy his age." Mason picked up his coffee. He looked at the door. Then he looked back at the dollar bill one more time. "Keep the change," he said. He walked out. The bell chimed once above him. Edith stood alone behind the counter. She looked down at the small, handwritten words on the crumpled bill and felt the weight of them settle over the quiet room. Outside, she could hear the low rumble of a motorcycle engine starting up. It idled for a long moment. Then, instead of pulling toward the highway the way most riders did, the sound moved slowly in the other direction. Toward town. The town of Harlow was not much to look at on a Saturday morning. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner with a faded awning, a pharmacy that kept short hours, and a handful of other shops that looked like they had been slowly giving up for years. A few residents moved along the sidewalks, running errands, walking dogs, carrying grocery bags. Nobody paid much attention to anybody else. Mason rode through it, slowly. He was not in a hurry. He kept his speed down and let his eyes move along both sides of the street. The engine of his bike rumbled low beneath him, steady and unhurried like a heartbeat. He could not get the words out of his head. "Help me." 2 words, written small and careful in the hand of a child, not scrawled in a panic, not scratched in anger, just placed there quietly, like someone whispering into an empty room and not really expecting an answer. That was the part that bothered him most. Whoever wrote that had not expected anyone to find it. They had not left a name or an address or a phone number. They had just sent 2 words out into the world on a folded dollar bill and walked away. Mason had known that feeling once. A long time ago. He pushed the thought down and kept riding. He had circled past the edge of town twice already without seeing anything, and he was starting to think the kid had taken a different road home. Then he turned onto Birch Street and spotted the blue hoodie about half a block ahead. The boy was on his bicycle, riding slowly along the cracked sidewalk. He had a small paper bag from the gas station sitting in the basket bolted to his handlebars. His head was down slightly. His shoulders were not squared up the way a happy kid's shoulders looked. They curved inward just a little, like he was protecting something. Mason eased off the throttle and let the distance between them stretch out. He did not want to spook him. He was not even sure why he was following him. He just knew he was not ready to stop yet. The boy turned left on Decker Road, and Mason gave him time before making the same turn. The neighborhood out this way was older and quieter. The houses were small and sat back from the road behind patchy lawns. Some of them were well kept, others were not. The boy slowed and turned up a cracked gravel path toward one of the houses near the end of the block. Mason pulled his bike to the curb about 4 houses back and cut the engine. He sat there and looked. The house was small and tired-looking. The white paint on the siding had gone dull and was peeling away in long strips near the corners. One of the porch steps had a board that sat crooked and wrong. The gutters along the roofline sagged in the middle, weighed down by years of neglect. The grass in the front yard was tall and uneven, with bare patches scattered across it like something had been slowly draining the life out of it from underneath. The boy walked his bike up the path and leaned it against the side of the porch. He climbed the steps carefully, stepping over the broken one without even looking at it, like he had done it 1,000 times before. The front door opened before the boy even reached it. A young man appeared in the doorway. He looked no more than 19, maybe 20, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of tired expression that did not come from one bad night of sleep. He was wearing a gas station uniform, still in it from what looked like an early morning shift. He said something to the boy and put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Then they both went inside, and the door closed behind them. Mason sat on his bike and looked at the house for a long moment. He pulled the dollar bill from his vest pocket. He looked at the 2 small words one more time. Then he folded it carefully and put it back. He needed to know more before he did anything at all. The next morning, Mason was parked down the block before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. He had brought coffee in a paper cup from the gas station. He sat sideways on his bike with one boot resting on the curb and drank it slowly. The street was still and quiet. A few birds moved in the oak trees overhead. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler kicked on. The light in the Parker house came on at 6:15. Mason watched the young man, Jake, come out the front door 20 minutes later. He was wearing a different uniform this time. Dark pants and a collared shirt with some kind of logo on the chest. He moved fast, like someone who had learned to stop wasting time. He locked the door behind him, jogged to an old pickup truck parked in the driveway, and backed out with a sound that suggested the truck needed a new muffler badly. Then it was quiet again. Mason finished his coffee and waited. Around 8, a light came on in one of the smaller windows. He figured that was the boys' room. A little while later, the front door opened, and Tommy came out onto the porch in a worn pair of jeans and a gray shirt. He sat down on the top step, the good one, not the broken one, and just looked out at the yard. He did not have a phone in his hand. He was not bouncing a ball or flipping through a comic book. He just sat there with his arms resting on his knees and looked at nothing in particular. That alone told Mason something. A 9-year-old boy with nothing to do, and nobody to do it with. Mason spent the rest of the morning watching the house from different spots along the block so he would not raise suspicion. He moved his bike twice. He walked a short stretch of the sidewalk once, hands in his jacket pockets, glancing over naturally as he passed. Jake came back around noon in yet another vehicle, a different one than the morning truck, which meant someone had picked him up, or he had a second job somewhere close enough to catch a ride. He was inside for less than 30 minutes. He came back out with a sandwich in his hand and said something to Tommy through the screen door before he left again. Tommy came out and sat on the porch again. He ate something too. Mason could not see what it was from where he sat. Something small. The afternoon passed slowly. A couple of kids from up the street rode their bikes past the house twice. Tommy watched them both times. He did not call out. He did not wave. He just watched them go by, and when they were gone, he looked back down at the step in front of him. Mason felt something tighten in his chest. He told himself to stop it. Jake returned for the evening just after 6. This time for good. His shoulders dropped the moment he stepped out of the truck. He rolled his neck and stood still for a second in the driveway, like he needed a moment to shift from one version of himself to another. Then he went inside. Mason moved closer. Not close enough to be seen, but close enough to catch what drifted through the open kitchen window on the warm evening air. The sound of a pan on the stove. The low murmur of a television. Small, ordinary sounds that somehow felt fragile in that house. He could see them through the window. Just barely. Jake standing at the stove. Tommy sitting at the kitchen table with his chin in his hand. Mason heard Tommy's voice first. Small and careful. "Jake," the boy said, "do you think Mom left because of us?" The pan went quiet. Jake's voice came back low and steady, but Mason could hear the effort in it. "No, Bud. I don't think that." "Then why hasn't she called?" Nobody answered that. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Mason stayed very still. The evening air moved gently through the trees, and neither boy inside said another word. The following afternoon, Mason pulled up to the Parker house and cut his engine. He sat on his bike for a moment, looking at the fence along the side yard. 3 boards were split clean through. 2 more leaned sideways like they were tired of standing. It was the kind of thing that had probably been broken for months, without anyone having the time or money to fix it. He had a reason to be here now. That was good enough. He grabbed the small bag of tools from his saddlebag and walked up to the yard without knocking. He figured he would start with the fence first and let the situation unfold on its own. He had only pulled the first broken board free when the front door swung open. Jake stepped onto the porch. He was in a white t-shirt and work pants, clearly home between shifts. His arms were crossed before he even reached the bottom step. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was not rude, but it was not warm either. It was the voice of someone who had learned to be careful about strangers. Mason straightened up and held up the broken board in one hand. "Saw this coming past," he said simply. "Figured I could fix it." Jake looked at the board. Then he looked at Mason. His eyes moved over the leather vest, the tattoos crawling up both arms, the patch on his chest. "I don't know you," Jake said. "Mason Cole," Mason said. "I stop at Edith's place most mornings." Something shifted slightly in Jake's expression. Edith's name carried weight in this town. Mason had counted on that. "I'm not looking for charity," Jake said. "It's a fence," Mason said, "not charity." Jake did not move from the bottom step. He stayed right there, watching, while Mason turned back to the fence and got to work. It was not comfortable. Mason could feel the young man's eyes on his back the whole time. But he kept his hands moving and said nothing more. After a few minutes, the screen door creaked. Tommy appeared in the doorway. He looked at Mason with wide, curious eyes, then looked at his brother standing rigid in the yard. "It's okay, Tommy," Jake said without turning around. "Stay on the porch." Tommy sat on the top step and watched Mason work. Mason glanced at him once and gave a short nod. The boy nodded back, just slightly, like he was not sure if he was allowed to do even that much. They stayed like that for a while. The sounds of the hammer, the soft creak of the old wood, the occasional car rolling slowly down the street. Jake eventually went inside. Not happily. But he went. The moment the door shut, Tommy came down the steps and crouched near the fence a few feet away. He picked up a loose nail from the grass and turned it over in his fingers. "You were at the gas station," Tommy said quietly. "Yesterday morning." Mason kept his eyes on the board he was setting. "I go most mornings." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did Edith tell you where I live?" Mason glanced over at him. The boy was looking at him with that same careful, measuring look that his brother had. But underneath it was something else. Something that looked a lot like hope, trying very hard not to be disappointed again. Mason set his hammer down and rested his arm on his knee. He looked at the boy directly. "She told me about you," he said. "Said you come in alone every week." Tommy looked at the nail in his hand. "She noticed that?" "She did." A few seconds passed. "Is that why you wrote what you wrote on that dollar bill?" Mason asked. Tommy's head came up fast. His cheeks went red. He looked like he might run. But he didn't. He looked back down at the nail and said very quietly, almost too quiet to hear, "I just thought if somebody saw it, maybe they'd care enough to ask." He paused. Nobody ever really asks. Mason said nothing. He stayed very still and let those words settle over him like something heavy and true. He picked up his hammer again, but his hands did not move. He stared at the fence board and felt the words land somewhere deep inside his chest. Nobody ever really asks. He knew exactly what that felt like. The sun had not yet come up when Mason turned off his headlight and coasted to a quiet stop half a block from the Parker house. He sat there for a moment in the dark. The neighborhood was completely still. No lights on anywhere. No birds yet. Just the cool, blue quiet that belongs to the hour before the world wakes up. He had not planned this exactly. He had driven to the grocery store the evening before telling himself he was just picking up a few things. But somewhere between the bread aisle and the canned goods, the basket had filled up. Eggs, milk, peanut butter. A box of the kind of cereal a 9-year-old would actually want to eat, not the generic off-brand stuff. Some soup, apples, a small block of cheese, a pack of sandwich meat. He had stood at the register looking at it all and felt slightly foolish. Then he had put it in his saddlebag anyway. Now he carried the 2 paper bags up the cracked front walk, moving carefully so his boots would not make noise on the broken porch steps. He set both bags against the door where they would be found first thing, tucked the top of one bag in neatly so nothing would spill. He stood back and looked at them sitting there. Then he walked back to his bike, started the engine quietly, and rode away before a single light came on anywhere on the street. He came back later that morning with his toolbox. Jake had already left for work. Mason knew the schedule by now. He had been paying attention. Tommy answered the door in his pajamas, hair sticking up, holding a piece of toast. He looked at Mason. He looked at the toolbox. Then he stepped back and held the door open without a word. Mason took that as enough of an invitation. He spent the first hour under the kitchen sink, replacing a pipe coupling that had been leaking long enough to warp the cabinet floor around it. The wood beneath was soft and dark with moisture. He made a note to come back with something to seal it properly. Tommy sat at the kitchen table doing homework, or at least holding a pencil over it. He kept glancing over at Mason. "You left those groceries," Tommy said eventually. It was not a question. "Somebody had to," Mason said from under the sink. Tommy chewed on that for a moment. Jake said maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe it was. Another pause. "We don't really know our neighbors," Tommy said. Mason said nothing to that. He turned the wrench another quarter turn and listened to the pipe hold. After the kitchen, he moved to the back door, which would not close flush because the frame had swelled and shifted. He planed it down with a hand tool, working slowly, checking the fit every few passes. Tommy followed him without being asked, standing nearby with his hands in his pockets, watching every move. "How do you know how to do all this?" Tommy asked. "Picked it up," Mason said. "You learn things when you have to." "Jake says that too," Tommy said. Mason glanced at him. The boy was leaning against the wall, watching the door swing cleanly shut for the first time in what looked like a very long time. Tommy pushed it open with one finger and let it swing closed again. Then again. Something moved across the boy's face. It started small, just a softening around the eyes. Then it spread, slow and real, until it became a full, genuine smile. The kind that a kid cannot fake and cannot stop. It lit up his whole face like someone had turned on a light inside him. Tommy pushed the door open one more time and watched it close perfectly. "It actually works," he said, almost to himself, like he had forgotten things could. Mason looked away. He set his hand tool back in the box and stared down at it for a moment. His jaw was tight. He realized, quietly, and without wanting to, that he cared very much what happened to this family. The next morning, Mason showed up again. He did not knock this time. He just started working. The porch was the worst of it. 2 of the front steps had rotted through almost completely, and the railing on the left side leaned outward at an angle that made it useless for anything except falling. Mason pulled the old boards up one by one, tossing them into a pile in the yard. He had brought new lumber strapped to the side of his bike with bungee cords. It looked ridiculous. He did not care. Tommy appeared in the doorway about 20 minutes in, still eating a piece of toast with peanut butter. The good peanut butter, from yesterday's groceries. He watched Mason pull a nail with the back of a hammer. "Can I help?" Tommy asked. Mason looked up at him. The boy was thin. Too thin. But his eyes were sharp and curious, and he held himself with a quiet kind of steadiness that most grown men never found. "You ever used a hammer?" Mason asked. "Some," Tommy said. Mason nodded toward the pile of lumber. "Hand me those 2 boards on top." Tommy set down his toast on the railing without thinking, then grabbed it again quickly when the whole thing wobbled. He looked at Mason. Mason looked at him. The boy almost smiled. "Yeah," Mason said. "Don't trust that yet." Tommy carried the boards over carefully. They worked like that for a while. Mason measuring and cutting, Tommy holding pieces steady, passing tools when asked, asking questions about why each step mattered. He was the kind of kid who wanted to understand the reason behind things, not just the steps. Mason answered every question straight. No baby talk. No brushing him off. By mid-morning, the bottom 2 steps were solid and new, the wood still pale and clean against the weathered gray of the rest of the porch. Tommy pressed his foot down on the new step hard. It did not move at all. "Strong," he said. "Built right," Mason said. "Things built right hold up." Tommy sat down on the new step and looked out at the overgrown yard. Mason sat on the porch edge beside him, taking a short break, rolling his water bottle between his palms. "Can I ask you something?" Tommy said. "Go ahead." "Do you think my mom left on purpose?" The question hung in the air. Direct. Honest. The kind of question only a child would ask out loud because adults had learned to swallow that kind of hurt down where it could not be seen. Mason was quiet for a moment. Not because he did not have an answer, but because the question deserved more than a fast one. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I don't think a mom who raised a kid like you just decides to walk away." Tommy looked at his shoes. Jake doesn't know where she is. He says she just stopped calling. When was the last time anybody heard from her? Tommy thought about it. Maybe 6 months ago. She called on my birthday. She sounded scared. Then nothing. Mason turned that over slowly. Scared. Not distant, not cold. Scared. She say anything else? She said she loved us, Tommy said, and that she was trying to get home. He paused. She said it like she meant it, like it was hard to say. Mason stared out at the yard. The long, tangled grass, a rusted bicycle frame half buried near the fence that had been there long before Mason arrived. He thought about what a woman sounds like when she is trying to hold herself together for her kids' sake, when she does not want them to hear the fear in her voice, but cannot hide it completely. Scared. Trying to get home. That was not the call of someone who had chosen to disappear. After he left the house that afternoon, Mason did not ride home. He sat in the parking lot of the local library for 10 minutes, then went inside and asked to use their computer. He started with her name, Sarah Parker, the town she had lived in, the surrounding counties. He did not expect to find much. The third result stopped him cold. A regional newspaper article, 7 months old. A car accident on a highway 2 counties over. A woman matching her description carried from the scene, listed in critical condition. The name in the article was hers. Mason woke up before the sun did. He lay on the narrow bed in his motel room and stared at the water stain on the ceiling for a long time. It spread out from the corner like a dark map of nowhere in particular. The room smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke from the previous tenant. The heater clicked and rattled every few minutes, but barely did anything about the cold. He had not slept well. Tommy's words kept coming back to him, replaying in the dark like a song stuck on a loop. She said she was trying to get home. She sounded scared. Mason sat up, rubbed his face with both hands, and got dressed. He was out the door before 6. The county records office did not open until 8:30. Mason found that out by standing in front of the locked glass door and reading the hours printed on a small laminated sign. He stood there for a moment in the cold, hands in his jacket pockets, then walked back to his bike and rode to the nearest diner to wait. He ordered black coffee and eggs he barely touched. At 8:25, he was back at the records office door. The woman behind the counter was maybe 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked up at Mason when he walked in, and her expression did not change much, but her posture shifted, straightened slightly, the way people did when they were deciding how to feel about something unexpected. "Morning," Mason said. He kept his voice low and even. He had learned a long time ago that the way he looked made people nervous before he said a single word. He could not fix that, but he could be careful about how he spoke. "Morning," the woman said. "I'm looking for records on a woman named Sarah Parker. I believe she may have been in an accident in this county or a neighboring one, roughly 7 months ago." The woman studied him for a moment. "Are you a family member?" "No," Mason said, "but her kids have no idea what happened to her. They're alone. Her youngest is 9 years old." Something shifted in the woman's expression. She looked at him for another second, then put her glasses on and turned to her computer. She could not give him much directly. Privacy rules. She explained that carefully, but she pointed him toward the public records terminal against the far wall and told him that accident reports filed with the county were available to anyone who knew how to look. Mason spent 2 hours at that terminal. He found nothing in that county. He widened the search. 1 county over, then 2. He was about to give up on that approach entirely and try something else when he found a brief entry in a public accident log. A vehicle collision on Route 9, heading west. 7 months and 3 days ago. 1 vehicle. 1 occupant. Transported by ambulance. Condition listed as critical. The name of the occupant was not included in the public log, but the date was there, and the road, and the general area. Mason wrote it all down in the small notebook he had started carrying in his jacket pocket 2 days ago. Then he rode to the regional hospital 20 miles away. The woman at the hospital information desk was polite, but firm. Patient records were private. She could not confirm or deny anything without authorization. Mason nodded and thanked her, and walked back outside. He stood by his bike in the hospital parking lot. The morning had turned gray, the sky pressing down low and flat. A cold wind moved through the lot and rattled a plastic bag caught against a fence near the entrance. He pulled out his notebook, looked at the date, looked at the road name. Then he thought about the newspaper. Local papers covered accidents, especially serious ones on rural highways. They were the kind of thing a small town paper printed because there was not much else happening. He found the regional paper's office on the main street of the next town over, a narrow building with a faded green awning. He went inside and asked if he could look through back issues. The young man at the desk pointed him toward a shelf of bound copies along the back wall without looking up from his screen. Mason pulled the volume covering the right month and carried it to a table. He turned pages slowly. Local elections, a school fundraiser, a road closure. Then he found it, a small article, bottom of page 4. The headline read, "Woman airlifted after single-car accident on Route 9. His eyes moved down the column. The driver had lost control on a rain-slicked curve. The car had gone through a guardrail. She had been pulled from the wreckage by a passing driver who called emergency services. She had been airlifted to a hospital with serious injuries. Her name was listed in the article. Sarah Parker, age 38, of Cedar Falls. Mason sat very still. He read the paragraph again, then a third time. She had not left her boys. She had not walked away. She had not chosen silence over her children. She had been on that highway, in the rain, and something terrible had happened to her. And somewhere between the wreck and the hospital and the weeks that followed, her sons had never been told. Mason closed the bound volume carefully. He set it back on the shelf. He walked out of the newspaper office and stood on the sidewalk in the gray morning air. Sarah Parker was real. Her disappearance had an explanation, and somewhere out there she existed. Injured, possibly still recovering, and 2 boys at home had spent 7 months believing their mother chose to leave them. Mason was back on the road before sunrise. The cold hit him square in the face as he pulled out of the motel parking lot, the kind of cold that gets into your bones no matter how thick your jacket is. He did not mind it much. He had ridden through worse, and today he had somewhere to be. The newspaper article had given him a name. The hospital that received Sarah after the accident was listed in the second paragraph. A larger facility, 2 counties east. But when he had called them yesterday from the motel payphone, the nurse on the line told him that Sarah Parker had been discharged from their care months ago. Discharged, but not to Cedar Falls, not home. Transferred, the nurse said, to a long-term rehabilitation facility. She could not tell him which one. Privacy policies. She said it in the same careful, apologetic tone that everyone in an official building seemed to use when they could not help you. Like they were sorry about the rules, but not sorry enough to break them. Mason had thanked her and hung up. Then he sat on the edge of the motel bed and thought it through. There were 4 rehabilitation facilities within reasonable distance of the accident site. He had looked them up using the phone book in the motel room desk drawer. the pages yellow and soft at the edges. He wrote down all 4 names and addresses in his notebook. Now he was going to visit every single one of them until he found her. The first 2 were dead ends. A receptionist at the first one shook her head before he even finished the name. The second one was a memory care facility. Wrong kind of place entirely. The third one was called Maplewood Recovery and Rehabilitation Center. It sat at the end of a long driveway lined with bare oak trees. The building was plain and low, tan brick with wide windows, and a small fountain out front that had been turned off for winter. A few plastic chairs sat on a covered porch, empty in the morning cold. Mason parked his bike and went inside. The lobby was warm and smelled like floor cleaner and something faintly like soup. A television in the corner played a morning news program with the volume turned low. A woman at the front desk looked up when he came in. He had gotten used to that look, the brief tightening around the eyes, the split second of uncertainty. He walked up calmly and put both hands flat on the counter so she could see them. "My name is Mason Cole," he said. "I'm trying to locate a patient. Sarah Parker. I believe she may have been transferred here from County General sometime in the last several months." The woman at the desk looked at him carefully. "Are you a family member?" "No," he said. "But her family needs to know she's here. Her 2 sons. Her youngest is 9. They don't know what happened to her. They think she's gone." Something moved across the woman's face. Not suspicion anymore. Something closer to sadness. She typed something. Looked at her screen. Typed again. Then she picked up the phone on her desk and spoke quietly into it. Mason could not make out the words. He waited with his hands still flat on the counter. A minute passed, then 2. A door opened down the hallway, and a woman in green scrubs walked toward the desk. She introduced herself as the patient care coordinator. She had kind eyes and tired ones at the same time, the way people look when they spend their days dealing with hard situations and still choose to show up. She asked Mason to follow her to a small office off the main hallway. He sat across from her at a narrow table. She folded her hands and looked at him carefully. Then she said the words that made the tightness in his chest finally break open like something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. "Yes," she said quietly. "Sarah Parker is a patient here. She has been with us for 6 months. She survived the accident, Mr. Cole. But her recovery has been very long and very difficult." She paused. "She has been trying to reach her children since the day she arrived." The drive back to Cedar Falls felt both long and short at the same time. Mason's hands were steady on the handlebars, but his mind was anything but. He kept turning the words over and over in his head. She has been trying to reach her children since the day she arrived. 6 months? 6 whole months of Sarah Parker fighting to get word to her boys, and not a single message ever making it through. The care coordinator had explained it carefully, laying the pieces out one by one, like she had been waiting for someone to finally come asking. The emergency contact form filled out at County General had listed a neighbor's phone number. A neighbor who had apparently moved away 2 months before the accident. Every call Sarah made from the facility went through a billing system that required her account to be in good standing. Her account was not in good standing. Her medical bills had stacked up fast, and the facility had restrictions on outgoing communications for patients with outstanding balances. It was not cruel, it was policy. But policy had quietly cut her off from the 2 people who needed her most. Every letter she had written to her home address went unanswered. Because Jake had moved them to a cheaper house 3 weeks after she disappeared. The mail never followed. Mason had sat in that small office and listened to every word. He had not interrupted once. When the coordinator finished, he asked just one question. "Does she know her boys are okay?" The coordinator shook her head slowly. "She does not." He had thanked her. He had gotten back on his bike. And now the winter sun was dropping low behind the tree line as he turned onto the familiar road that led to the Parker house. The porch light was on when he pulled up. A warm yellow glow against the darkening sky. He knocked twice. Jake opened the door still wearing his work shirt, the one with the name of the hardware store stitched above the pocket. He looked at Mason with the usual mix of gratitude and quiet wariness that had become their normal. "Hey," Jake said. "You eat? I was about to heat up some chili." "I'm all right," Mason said. "I need to talk to you both, you and Tommy. Can I come in?" Jake studied his face for a moment. He stepped back and opened the door wider. Tommy was at the kitchen table doing homework, a stub of pencil in his hand, and a look of deep concentration on his face. He looked up when Mason walked in, and his expression shifted immediately to something bright and easy, the way kids look when they are genuinely happy to see someone. "Hey, Mason," Tommy said. "Hey, bud." Mason pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. Jake leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, watching. Mason was not a man who spent much time figuring out how to say things. He usually just said them. But he sat there for just 1 second longer than usual, holding the weight of what he was about to give these two boys. Then he set his hands flat on the table and looked at them both. "I found your mom." The kitchen went absolutely silent. Tommy's pencil rolled off the table and hit the floor. Neither of them moved to pick it up. Jake's arms dropped slowly from across his chest. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. "She's alive," Mason said. "She's been in a rehabilitation center about 2 hours from here. She was in a bad accident, and there were a whole lot of mistakes with paperwork and phone numbers and bills, and none of it was her fault. She has been trying to reach you boys since the day she got there." Tommy made a sound that was not quite a word. It started in his chest and came out small and broken, the sound of something that had been hurting quietly for a very long time finally being allowed to let go. Jake pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His shoulders shook once. Then tears ran down his face without any warning at all, like a dam that had simply reached its limit. Tommy slid off his chair and walked around the table slowly, almost like he was not sure his legs were working. He stopped in front of Mason and looked up at him with wet eyes and a trembling chin. "She didn't leave us?" Tommy whispered. Mason shook his head. "She never left you for a single second, kid." Tommy buried his face in Mason's chest and sobbed. Tommy woke up before his alarm. That almost never happened. He lay still for a moment, blinking at the water stain on his bedroom ceiling. Then the memory hit him all at once, warm and golden, like sunlight pouring through a window. Mom is alive. He sat straight up. She had not left them. She had not chosen to disappear. She was out there right now, 2 hours away, in a building somewhere, probably thinking about them the same way he had been thinking about her every single day for 6 months. He threw his covers back, and his feet hit the cold floor, and he did not even care about the cold. He padded down the hallway to Jake's room and pushed the door open. Jake was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his elbows on his knees and his hair sticking up in about 4 different directions. He looked like he had not slept much, but his eyes were different this morning, less heavy, like some enormous invisible thing had been lifted just enough to let him breathe. "You're up early," Jake said. "I couldn't sleep," Tommy said. He leaned against the doorframe. "When do you think she'll come home?" Jake rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know yet, Bud. Mason said he's going to work on it. But soon, right? Jake looked at him for a moment. I hope so. Tommy decided that was good enough for now. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a bowl of cereal, the good kind that Mason had left in the latest grocery bag on the porch, and he sat at the table and let himself imagine it. His mom coming through the front door, the way she smelled, like lavender soap, and something warm he could never quite name. The way she always hugged him with both arms and held on for an extra second longer than most moms did. The way she said his name, not just Tommy, but his full name when she was happy to see him. Like the word itself meant something special to her. He imagined her sitting at this very table, drinking coffee in the morning the way she used to, with both hands wrapped around the mug. He imagined Jake finally being able to stop working so many shifts. He imagined the house feeling like a home again, instead of just a place where two people tried their best to survive. He finished his cereal and rinsed the bowl in the sink, and then he went to find a piece of paper and a pencil. He was going to start making a list of everything he wanted to tell her. Mason arrived mid-morning with 2 cups of gas station coffee and a folder tucked under his arm. Tommy answered the door before he even knocked. Did you talk to her? Tommy asked immediately. Mason held up one of the coffee cups. Is your brother home? He's got a shift at noon. He's here now. Good. They sat around the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Mason opened the folder. Inside were several pages of notes he had written by hand the night before, phone numbers, names, dates, and amounts. His handwriting was blocky and a little rough around the edges, but it was organized. Everything lined up in neat rows. Jake leaned forward and looked at the top page. His expression shifted almost immediately. That number, Jake said, pointing to a figure near the top of the page. What is that? That's what she owes the facility, Mason said. He kept his voice steady. Between the long-term care charges and the medical debt that transferred over from County General, that's the balance standing between her and a release. Jake sat back slowly in his chair. Tommy looked between the 2 of them. What does that mean? Mason tapped the folder with one finger. It means getting her home isn't just about going to pick her up. There are bills that have to be settled and legal paperwork that has to be signed off on before they can discharge her. Jake stared at the ceiling. The number on that page was not a small one. Mason was up before the sun. He sat at the small table in his motel room with the folder open in front of him and a fresh cup of coffee going cold beside his elbow. He had a legal pad. He had a pen. He had a list of names and numbers he had spent the previous evening tracking down. He picked up his phone and got to work. The first call was to a legal aid office 2 counties over. He explained the situation carefully. Sarah Parker, traffic accident, rehabilitation facility, administrative errors, children waiting at home. The woman on the other end was polite. She told him their intake list was currently full. She told him they were not accepting new cases until the following quarter. She gave him 2 other numbers to try. He wrote them down and called both. The first number rang 12 times and nobody answered. The second connected him to a voicemail box that was full. He set the phone down and looked out the window for a moment. The parking lot outside was still dark. A street light buzzed faintly at the far end of the lot, flickering like it was tired. Mason picked the phone back up. By 9 in the morning, Jake arrived at the motel. He knocked twice, and Mason let him in. Jake looked at the legal pad, which now had 2 full pages of notes, crossed-out numbers, and question marks scattered throughout. Any luck? Jake asked. Some. Mason pulled out a chair. Sit down. Jake sat. I got through to a social services office about an hour ago, Mason said. They can assign a caseworker to review the situation, that's something. But the woman I spoke to said the review process takes 4 to 6 weeks minimum. Jake's jaw tightened. We don't have 4 to 6 weeks. You said the facility might transfer her if the billing situation isn't resolved. That's right. So the one person who can officially help us moves too slow to actually help us. That's about the size of it. Jake pressed both hands flat on the table. He stared at the legal pad for a moment like he was trying to read something between the lines. What about the billing? Is there any way to negotiate with the facility directly? I spoke to their billing administrator this morning. Mason leaned back in his chair. She was willing to talk. But the number doesn't move much just by asking nicely. They've got policies, insurance gaps, outstanding transfers from the original hospital. It's not one bill. It's a chain of bills, each one connected to the next, and every office I call sends me to another office. Jake was quiet for a moment. There's also a legal piece, Mason continued. Because Tommy is a minor, and Sarah is still technically in medical care, any formal transfer of custody or guardianship that happened informally, meaning you stepping up to raise him without any court paperwork, that creates complications. A lawyer would need to sort out what's documented and what isn't before anyone can sign off on her discharge. Jake looked at him. I was 19. I just took care of my brother. I didn't think about paperwork. I know, Mason said. He said it simply, without judgment. Nobody would. Jake stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the parking lot the same way Mason had earlier, like the answer might be parked out there somewhere. So, what do we do? Jake asked. Mason looked down at his legal pad. 2 full pages. Multiple dead ends. A chain of problems that each required a different person to solve, and most of those people were either unavailable, slow-moving, or pointed him somewhere else entirely. He had handled difficult things before in his life. He had dealt with situations that most people would walk away from. But this was different. This was forms and phone trees and bureaucratic walls stacked 3 deep, and none of it responded to stubbornness alone. He tapped his pen against the pad slowly. One man making phone calls was not going to be enough. This was going to take more than he had on his own. The next few days moved quickly. Mason showed up at the Parker house every morning. Sometimes he brought supplies, sometimes he brought tools, sometimes he just brought himself and figured out what needed doing when he got there. On Monday, he replaced 3 broken boards on the front porch steps. The old wood had gone soft and spongy from years of rain soaking in. He pulled each board up carefully, measured the new lumber, cut it clean, and nailed it down solid. Tommy sat on the railing the whole time watching. He asked questions about every single step. Why that nail size? Why that kind of wood? Mason answered each one without rushing him. By the time Jake came home that evening, the steps held firm under his boots for the first time in what felt like years. On Tuesday, Mason fixed the side gate latch and patched a section of the yard fence that had collapsed entirely into the weeds. He hauled off the rotted wood himself and stacked new panels in its place. The neighbor across the street stood on her porch and watched him work. She did not wave. She just watched. On Wednesday, he showed up with 2 large bags of groceries and set them on the kitchen counter without making a production of it. Real food this time. Eggs and bread and chicken and a bag of apples that Tommy immediately started eating before Mason had even put the rest away. Mason looked at him and shook his head slowly, but the corner of his mouth pulled up just slightly. On Thursday, he borrowed a working lawn mower from the motel's maintenance man and spent the better part of the morning cutting the overgrown yard down to something that looked like people actually lived there. The grass had been knee-high in some places. By noon it was even and green, and the whole front of the house looked different, like it was breathing again. Tommy stood in the yard afterward and looked around at it with big eyes. "It looks like a real house," he said. Mason set the mower aside. "It is a real house." Tommy thought about that for a second. Then he nodded like that settled something inside him. The problem was, people were noticing. A man like Mason was hard to miss on a good day. His bike was loud. His size was hard to ignore. And the leather vest he always wore, with the Hell's Angels patches sewn across the back, was not the kind of thing that blended into a quiet, rural neighborhood. By Thursday afternoon, 2 women from the street over were talking in hushed voices outside the hardware store on Main. By Friday morning, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who ran the barber shop on the corner, had already shared his opinion with 4 separate customers before 10 o'clock. His opinion was not a kind one. "That man has no business being around those boys," Gerald said, leaning against his counter with his arms crossed. "A Hell's Angel. You know what that means. You know what those people are involved in." The customer in the chair said nothing, but he listened. By Friday afternoon, a small group of parents whose children walked past the Parker house on the way to school had started talking amongst themselves in the parking lot of the grocery store. One mother said she felt uncomfortable with her kids walking that route. Another said she had seen the motorcycle parked out front 2 mornings in a row. "Who even is he?" she asked. "Does anybody actually know him?" Nobody answered that question directly. At the gas station, Edith heard 3 different versions of the same rumor before the lunch hour was done. Each version was a little worse than the one before it. By the 3rd telling, someone had added details that were not true at all, but that did not seem to slow the story down any. The town had made up its mind quickly, and the decision, for most people, came down to one simple thing. They had seen the vest. That was enough. Saturday morning came in gray and cool. A thin layer of fog sat over the rooftops of the town like a held breath. The streets were quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like it is waiting for something. Mason arrived at the gas station just before 8. He needed coffee, and he needed to think. He had calls to make that day. A social worker in the next county had agreed to return his call about Sarah's paperwork, and a legal aid office 2 towns over had said they might be able to help with the authorization forms. He had a list in his jacket pocket. He had been adding to it all week. He pulled his bike into the lot and killed the engine. Inside, Edith was already behind the counter. She had been there since 6, same as always. The coffee was fresh, and the small television mounted in the corner above the cigarette display was showing the local morning news with the volume turned low. Mason poured his coffee and set a few dollars on the counter. Edith did not take them right away. She looked at him steadily, the way she sometimes did, like she was reading something written just behind his eyes. "I heard what people have been saying," she said. Mason picked up his cup. "Doesn't matter." "It matters plenty," she said, "and I want you to know I told every single one of them the same thing." He looked at her. "I told them what I saw with my own eyes," she said. "A man who noticed a child that nobody else bothered to notice. That's what I told them." Mason did not say anything. He wrapped both hands around the paper cup and looked down at it. Edith leaned forward slightly on the counter. "You keep doing what you're doing," she said quietly. "Don't let small minds slow down something good." The pastor's name was Reverend Dale Hutchins. He led the small congregation at Calvary Grace Church, which sat on the edge of town behind a row of old oak trees. He was a lean man in his early 60s with silver hair and a calm way of speaking that made people feel like they had time to think before answering. That Saturday morning, he walked into the diner on Main Street, where a group of neighbors had gathered at the big corner table. He had heard the conversations. He had listened carefully and said little for several days. But Saturday morning he sat down with them and folded his hands on the table and spoke plainly. "I've watched that man work," he said. "I drove past the Parker house 4 times this week. 4 times I saw him out there in the yard, or on the porch, or hauling something that needed hauling. I never once saw him do anything that wasn't decent." Gerald Pruitt started to say something. The Reverend kept going, gently but firmly. "I know what you're looking at when you look at him," he said. "I understand why it makes people uneasy. But what I cannot do, and what I will not do, is stand by while a man who is helping 2 boys gets treated like a threat. That doesn't sit right with me. And I don't think it sits right with most of you either, if you're being honest." The table was quiet for a moment. Then one of the men, a retired veteran named Carl Briggs, who had barely spoken during the previous conversations, nodded once. "I'll be honest," Carl said. "I drove past myself, saw him mowing that yard." He paused. That yard hadn't been touched in a long time. Nobody argued with that. By mid-morning, Reverend Hutchins had stopped by the Parker house and introduced himself to Mason directly. They shook hands on the newly repaired porch steps. The Reverend asked what was needed. Mason told him, plainly and without decoration, the full situation with Sarah. The Reverend listened to every word. Then Carl Briggs showed up behind him with 2 other veterans from the local post. Then a woman from the church arrived with a notepad and a pen and asked Mason what calls still needed to be made. Mason stood on that porch, looking at the small group gathered in the yard below him. He did not quite know what to do with it. The last customer left just before 6. Edith turned the sign on the door from open to closed and slid the deadbolt across with a quiet click. She moved slowly back behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at Mason through the window. He was outside in the lot, sitting on the steps near the air pump, finishing the last of a coffee he had poured an hour ago and probably forgotten about. She knocked on the glass. He looked up. She waved him inside. He came through the door with his cup still in his hand, ducking slightly out of habit even though the doorframe was tall enough. He looked around the empty station the way he always did when he entered a room. Checking corners, old habit. "You need something fixed?" he asked. "No," she said. "I need you to sit down." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out the stool near the end of the counter and sat on it. It creaked under his weight, but held. Edith did not rush. She finished wiping down the counter. She rinsed a cloth in the small sink behind her. She folded it neatly over the faucet handle. Mason waited. He had learned that Edith moved on her own schedule, and there was no point trying to hurry her. Finally, she reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small metal tin. It was old, the kind that had once held hard candies, with a faded floral print on the lid. She set it on the counter between them. "I've had this tin for a long time," she said. Mason looked at it, but did not touch it. "I keep things in here that I don't want to lose," she said. Little things. Things that meant something, even if I couldn't explain why at the time. She lifted the lid carefully. Inside were a few folded slips of paper, a faded photograph, a small pressed flower that had gone brown at the edges, and near the bottom, a folded piece of paper that looked older than the rest. More worn, creased so many times the folds had gone soft. Edith reached in and took out the older piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly. It was a $1 bill. She set it flat on the counter and smoothed it gently with her palm. Mason leaned forward without meaning to. The bill was old. The ink had faded in places and the paper had gone thin at the corners. But there were words written on it, small, unsteady handwriting. The letters pressed hard into the paper the way a person writes when their hand is shaking. 2 words. "Help me." Mason went very still. He stared at the bill. He did not blink. His coffee cup lowered slowly to the counter without him seeming to notice he had set it down. "I found that bill in my register 30 years ago," Edith said quietly. "Maybe more. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember the week because things were slow and I was paying close attention to who came through." She paused. It was a boy. Young. Maybe 15 or 16. Thin as a rail. He had a bruise along his jaw that he kept turning away from me so I wouldn't see it. The fluorescent light above the counter hummed softly. "He came in for a bottle of water," she said. "Paid with that dollar. Didn't say much. Kept his eyes down." She looked at Mason directly. "I didn't know his name then. I didn't find out until much later. Years later when I saw his face again." Her eyes did not leave his. "Mason," she said gently. "That was you." The word landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Mason looked at the bill. He looked at the handwriting. Those small, pressed, shaking letters. Something moved across his face. Something deep and old and long buried. His jaw tightened. His eyes went glassy. He did not speak. Mason did not sleep much that night. He lay on the narrow bed in his motel room and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. The room smelled like old carpet and cheap soap. The heater rattled in the corner. Outside, a truck passed on the highway every now and then, its headlights sweeping across the curtains in a slow arc. He kept seeing that dollar bill. Those 2 words in his own handwriting. Small and shaking and desperate. The handwriting of a boy who had nobody. He remembered that day at the gas station. Not clearly at first. More like pieces coming back. The way cold water feels when you splash it on your face in the dark. Sharp. Sudden. He remembered the bruise on his jaw. His stepfather's ring had left it there. He remembered pulling his collar up and keeping his chin down so nobody would ask questions. He remembered counting the coins in his pocket outside the gas station door, hoping he had enough for water, hoping nobody would look at him too long. He had been 15 years old. He remembered writing on the bill before he went inside. He had not planned it. He had just found a pen in his jacket pocket, and suddenly his hand was moving, and the words were there before he could stop them. "Help me." He had not known who he was writing to. He had not expected anyone to see it. He had just needed for one small moment to say it out loud in some way, even silently. Even on a piece of paper that would disappear into someone's register and never be seen again. And it never was. Not by anyone who could help. He had gone home that night, and the night after that. And eventually he had stopped going home at all. He was 16 when he left for good. He had a backpack and $40 and no plan. He slept in a park for 3 nights before a group of bikers found him near a diner outside of town. They fed him. They asked no questions. They made space for him at their table like it was the most natural thing in the world. He followed them when they left. It was not a good life at first. But it was a life. And after years of feeling invisible, being seen by anyone felt like something close to grace. He had built walls after that, thick ones. He told himself he did not need saving. He told himself he was fine. He told himself the past was done and buried, and had nothing to do with who he was now. He believed that for a long time. Until a 9-year-old boy wrote 2 words on a dollar bill, and Mason felt the ground shift under his feet. He drove to the Parker house the next morning without planning to. Tommy was sitting on the repaired porch steps, tossing a small rubber ball against the ground and catching it. He looked up when Mason's bike rumbled to a stop at the curb. His face opened up the way it always did. That easy, warm brightness that Mason still was not used to seeing directed at him. "Hey," Tommy said. "Hey." Mason cut the engine. He sat there for a moment. Then he swung off the bike and walked over and sat down on the step beside the boy. They were quiet for a bit. Tommy tossed the ball, caught it, tossed it again. "You okay?" Tommy asked. "You look tired." "Didn't sleep great." "Me neither sometimes," Tommy said. "I think too much at night." Mason looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Tommy caught the ball and held it in both hands. He glanced sideways at Mason the way he did when he was deciding whether to say something. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Mason said. "Were you ever a kid who felt like nobody saw you?" The question was so simple, so direct, the way only a child can ask something that cuts right to the bone. Mason was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I was." Tommy nodded slowly, like that meant something important to him. "Me too," he said softly. Mason looked out at the yard, at the patchy grass and the oak tree at the edge of the fence. A bird was hopping along one of the lower branches, pecking at the bark. "I was about your age when I first started feeling that way," Mason said. "Maybe a little older, but I remember it." Tommy set the ball down on the step beside him and folded his hands in his lap. He was listening the way he always listened. Completely. Like what you were saying was the most important thing in the world. "My mom left when I was real young," Mason said. "Barely remember her face. My dad wasn't around much either. And when he was—" He stopped. He looked down at his hands, the tattoos along his knuckles, the old scar across his left thumb. "When he was around, it wasn't good. Did he hurt you?" Mason did not answer right away. "Sometimes," he said. Tommy was quiet. "I used to think it was my fault," Mason said. "Kids do that. Think everything bad that happens must be because of something they did, something they didn't do, something they should have been." "I thought that too," Tommy said. "About my mom leaving. I thought maybe if I'd been better she would have stayed." Mason looked at him then, straight at him. "That is not true," he said. "Not even a little bit." Tommy's chin trembled slightly. He pressed his lips together and nodded. "I know that now," Tommy said quietly. "But I didn't for a long time." "I know," Mason said. "I didn't know it either. Not for years." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I ran away at 16. Found a group of guys on motorcycles who didn't ask what I came from. Just made room for me." He paused. "Wasn't always the right kind of life. But it was the first time I ever felt like I belonged somewhere." Tommy was watching him carefully. "That's sad," Tommy said. "Not meanly, just honestly." Mason almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." "You never had anybody looking for you?" The question landed quietly. Mason felt it settle in his chest like a weight. "No," he said. "Nobody came looking." Tommy reached over then. Small and unhesitating. He put his hand on top of Mason's hand the way a child does when they want you to know they understand without using any more words. Mason looked down at that small hand resting on his. He did not pull away. The call was set for 10 in the morning. Mason had spent 2 days arranging it. He had talked to 3 different people at the rehabilitation facility. A receptionist, a case manager, a floor supervisor named Linda, who had finally agreed to bring a phone to Sarah's room at a specific time. He had written the time on a piece of paper and handed it to Jake the night before. Jake had read it, looked up, looked back down at the paper. His jaw had gone tight the way it did when he was trying to hold something in. "She knows we're calling?" Jake had asked. "She knows," Mason said. Jake had folded the paper carefully, tucked it into his shirt pocket. He did not say anything else. He did not have to. Tommy was up before 7. He had already eaten breakfast and washed his bowl by the time Jake came downstairs. He was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands folded in front of him, like he was waiting for class to start. His hair was combed. He was wearing his good blue shirt, the one he saved for important things. Jake stopped in the doorway when he saw him. "You combed your hair," Jake said. "She hasn't seen me in a long time," Tommy said seriously. "I know it's just a phone call, but still." Jake leaned against the door frame. Something moved across his face. Something soft and painful and proud all at once. He cleared his throat. "Yeah," he said. "Good thinking." Mason arrived at 9:45. He knocked twice and let himself in the way he had started doing when Jake told him he did not need to knock anymore. He was carrying a paper bag with 3 coffees and a hot chocolate. He set the hot chocolate in front of Tommy without being asked. Tommy looked up at him. "Is she going to sound the same?" Mason pulled out a chair and sat down. "I don't know," he said honestly. "She's been through a lot, but she's been waiting for this just as much as you have. Maybe more." Tommy wrapped both hands around the paper cup. "What if she's different?" "People go through hard things and come out changed," Mason said. "That doesn't mean they love you different." Tommy thought about that. Then he nodded once and went back to staring at his hot chocolate. The clock above the stove moved slowly. Jake sat beside Tommy. Mason sat across from them both. Nobody talked much. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. At exactly 10 o'clock, Mason slid his phone across the table to Jake. The number was already on the screen. Jake looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Tommy. Tommy straightened in his chair and took a breath. Jake pressed the button. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice said, "Hello?" Tommy made a sound, small and sharp and completely unguarded, like something that had been locked up tight inside him had just broken open all at once. "Mom?" he whispered. A pause. And then, from the other end of the line, a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Baby." Sarah's voice cracked wide open on that one word. "Oh, Tommy. Oh, my baby." Tommy pressed the phone against his ear with both hands. Tears ran down his face freely. He did not wipe them away. "I thought you left us," he said. His voice was small, shaking. "I thought you didn't want us anymore." "Never." Her voice came through fierce and broken and full. "Never, never, never. I never left you. I have been trying to get back to you every single day. Do you hear me? Every single day." "I hear you," Tommy breathed. Jake dropped his face into his hands. His shoulders shook. Mason looked away from both of them and fixed his eyes on the window. On the pale morning sky outside, on nothing in particular. But he stayed right where he was, because some moments are not meant to be witnessed alone. The morning after the phone call, Tommy woke up different. Not completely. The worry was still there. The waiting was still there. But underneath all of it, something new had taken root. Something small and warm and stubborn. His mother's voice had done that. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. Then he got up, got dressed, and went straight to the kitchen drawer where Jake kept old markers and tape. He had work to do. By mid-morning, the kitchen table was covered in construction paper. Tommy had found a leftover pack from last school year, a little dried out but still usable. He had 3 markers working and one that had given up entirely. He did not mind. He pressed down harder with the ones he had and kept going. He was making a banner. The letters were careful and big. He had measured them out with a ruler so they would all be the same size. It took 3 pieces of paper taped together to fit the whole thing. "Welcome home, Mom?" He stood back and looked at it, tilted his head. Then he added a heart at the end because it felt incomplete without one. Jake passed through the kitchen and stopped when he saw it. "That's real good, Bud," he said quietly. "It's not finished," Tommy said. "I'm going to add color around the edges. And maybe her name—" Jake nodded. He rested a hand briefly on the back of Tommy's head. Then he grabbed his keys and headed out to meet Mason and Pastor Gerald down at the community hall. The community hall on Birchwood Street had not been this full on a weekday in a long time. Folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as people filed in. Edith was already there when Jake arrived, sitting near the front with a casserole dish on her lap and a notepad on top of that. A tall man named Roy, who ran the hardware store, had brought a whiteboard. 2 women from the Baptist church had brought a coffee urn and a stack of paper cups. Pastor Gerald stood at the front of the room and waited for the noise to settle. He was a patient man. He had a round, calm face and hands that always seemed too big for his body. He had been the one to spread the word through his congregation, and those people had spread it further. "Most of you know the situation," he said once the room had quieted. "There's a mother who needs to come home. There are boys who need their family back together, and there are real costs standing in the way." He let that sit for a moment. "We're here to take care of those costs." Roy uncapped a marker and wrote a number on the whiteboard. The total needed. It was not a small number. A few people shifted in their seats when they saw it, but nobody got up and left. Edith spoke next. She did not stand up. She just raised her voice the way she always did, clear and direct, like she was speaking to someone she had known her whole life. "I've watched this town decide what kind of place it wants to be," she said. "More than once. I'd like to see us get it right this time." A murmur moved through the room. Then hands started going up. Roy wrote figures on the board as the people called them out. $20. 50. 100 from the auto repair shop on Route 9. The women from the Baptist church announced a bake sale for Saturday. A group of veterans in the back row spoke quietly among themselves, and then raised a number that made the room go still for a second, before someone started clapping. The number on the whiteboard grew. Not fast, not all at once, but steadily, the way water fills a bucket when you are patient enough to keep pouring. By the time the meeting ended, the gap between what was needed and what had been given had already begun to close. The week moved fast. Every morning brought something new. A donation dropped off at Edith's counter in a plain envelope, a jar of coins left on the community hall steps. A local diner put up a handwritten sign near the register that said, "Round up for Sarah," and customers added their extra change without being asked. Tommy heard about each one. Jake would come home from the meetings and tell him what had happened that day, and Tommy would sit at the kitchen table and listen with his chin resting in both hands. Then he would go back to working on the decorations. He had finished the banner. Now he was making paper flowers out of old newspaper and yellow paint, because he remembered his mother liked yellow. Mason kept showing up. He was on the phone constantly, sitting at Edith's counter with papers spread out in front of him, driving across county lines to talk to administrators and lawyers and anyone else who might move things along. He did not talk much about what he was doing. He just kept doing it. On Thursday, Roy announced at the community hall that the fundraising total had reached just over halfway. It was good news. But the number on the whiteboard still had a long way to go. That was when Mason stood up. He did not speak the way Pastor Gerald did, calm and measured with his hands folded. Mason stood with his arms crossed and his voice low, the way a man talks when he means exactly what he says, and nothing more. "I'm organizing a ride for Saturday," he said. "Any rider who wants to join is welcome. We'll collect donations along the route and finish here in town. Anyone who wants to come out and watch, come out." Roy wrote it on the whiteboard. Edith smiled into her coffee cup. Saturday came with a blue sky and cool air that smelled like pine and dry grass. By 8 in the morning, motorcycles were already gathering in the parking lot behind the hardware store. Mason stood near his bike in his leather vest, talking to a group of riders he had contacted through the week. Some were from neighboring towns. Some had driven more than an hour to be there. A few were Hell's Angels like him. Others were veterans. Others were just people who liked to ride and had heard what the day was about. Tommy stood on the sidewalk and watched them line up. He counted 23 bikes before he lost track. The sound of the engines warming up filled the whole street, rolling and steady, like distant thunder that decided to stay close. Jake stood beside him with his hands in his jacket pockets. "That's a lot of bikes," Tommy said. "Yeah," Jake said. "It really is." Mason walked over before they rolled out. He crouched down in front of Tommy so they were eye to eye. His expression was serious, the way it usually was, but his eyes were soft in a way Tommy had learned to recognize. "We'll be back by afternoon," Mason said. "You going to be okay?" Tommy nodded. "Bring her home, Mason." Mason held his gaze for a moment. Then he stood up, put on his helmet, and walked back to his bike. The line of motorcycles pulled out of the parking lot one by one and moved on to the main road. The sound built and built until it filled the whole morning, and then slowly faded as they disappeared around the bend. The town felt quiet after they left. They came back at 2:30. The parking lot was full of people by then. Word had spread through the day, and families had come out to watch. Tommy was sitting on the curb next to Edith when he heard the engines returning in the distance. Mason walked into the community hall with a canvas bag and set it on the table in front of Roy. Roy counted it out, added it to the total on the whiteboard, stepped back. Then he turned around and held up both hands. The room erupted. The number on the whiteboard was no longer a gap to cross. It was a goal that had been met and then surpassed by enough that Roy had to add a second line just to fit it all. The call came early Sunday morning. Mason was still at Edith's counter with a cup of coffee going cold beside him when his phone buzzed against the wood. He looked at the number. Then he straightened up and answered it. The woman on the other end spoke in a careful, professional tone. She introduced herself as the Patient Services Coordinator at Clover Ridge Rehabilitation Center. She said they had received the financial clearance documentation late the previous evening. She said the remaining legal authorization had been reviewed and approved. She said Sarah Parker's release was being scheduled. Mason set his coffee cup down slowly. "When?" he asked. "We're targeting end of this week," the woman said. "Thursday at the latest. We'll confirm the exact time by Tuesday morning." Mason thanked her. He put the phone in his pocket. Then he sat there for a moment without moving, staring at the countertop. Edith appeared from the back room carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She looked at his face and stopped walking. "Well?" she said. Mason looked up at her. "She's coming home." Edith set the pot down on the burner and pressed both hands flat against the counter. Her eyes went bright and wet at the edges. She pressed her lips together and nodded slowly, the way people do when a feeling is too big to let out all at once. "Good," she said quietly. "That's real good, Mason." He drove to the Parker house before 9. Jake answered the door still in his work clothes from an overnight shift, his eyes red from tiredness. He looked at Mason's face and seemed to understand immediately that something had changed. "Tell me," Jake said. "They called this morning," Mason said. "She's being released. Thursday at the latest." Jake put one hand on the doorframe. He looked down at the floor for a moment and his jaw tightened the way it did when he was trying to hold himself steady. Then he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "Thursday," he repeated. "They'll confirm the exact time Tuesday." Jake nodded. He stepped back and let Mason in. Tommy was at the kitchen table eating toast. He was still in his pajamas, a worn blue pair with a small hole near the collar, and his hair was sticking up on one side from sleep. He looked up when Mason came in and read the room the way he always did, quietly and quickly, scanning both their faces. "What happened?" Tommy asked. Mason pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "Your mom is coming home Thursday." Tommy blinked. He looked at Mason, then at Jake standing in the doorway, then back at Mason. "For real?" he whispered. "For real," Mason said. Tommy's chin started to tremble, but then a smile broke across his face, wide and sudden and completely unguarded, the kind of smile a kid makes when something they stopped letting themselves believe in turns out to be true. He pushed back from the table and ran down the hall. They heard drawers opening, the sound of tape being peeled. Jake leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and a quiet smile on his face, watching the hallway. Tommy came back carrying the banner he had made 2 weeks earlier. It was painted on a long piece of butcher paper in big, uneven letters. The paint was a little smeared in places. One corner had a crinkle in it from being rolled up too long. He had decorated the edges with the yellow paper flowers he made from old newspaper. "Welcome home, Mom!" He carried it to the front door and stood on his tiptoes, pressing a piece of tape to the top corner. Then the other corner. He stepped back and looked at it. The banner hung slightly crooked. Tommy didn't fix it. He just stood there in his pajamas with dried yellow paint on his fingers and looked at those 3 words hanging on the door of the house that had felt empty for so long. Jake came up beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Almost over," Jake said softly. Tommy nodded. "Almost." Monday morning arrived bright and cold. Tommy was up before Jake. He padded into the kitchen in his socks and poured himself a glass of orange juice, the last of it, and stood at the window watching the sun come up over the tree line. The sky was pale pink at the edges and deep blue in the middle. Birds were moving around in the yard. 2 more days. Maybe less. He counted it out in his head the way he had been doing since Sunday. Sunday was gone. Monday was here. Tuesday they would get the exact time. Wednesday they could prepare. Thursday she would walk through that door. He looked at the banner hanging on the front door from the inside. The light came through the thin paper just enough that he could see the shadow of the letters. "Welcome home, Mom." He pressed his palm flat against it for a second. Then he went to make toast. Mason arrived mid-morning with a folder under his arm. He spread papers across the kitchen table while Jake sat across from him, drinking coffee and going through each page carefully. There were discharge authorization forms and medical release summaries and a transport agreement from the facility. There were copies of the fundraiser receipts and a letter from the community fund confirming the financial contribution. Everything looked right. Mason had been on the phone with the patient coordinator 3 times since the previous morning. Each call had been short and straightforward. Documents received, documents reviewed, processing underway. "They said they'd call by noon today to confirm Tuesday's timeline," Mason said. He flattened one of the pages and slid it toward Jake. "This one needs your signature. You're listed as next of kin." Jake signed it without hesitating. Tommy sat on the couch nearby, watching them work. He had his knees pulled up to his chest and his chin resting on top of them. Every few minutes he glanced at the clock on the wall. "How many hours?" he asked. Mason looked up. "Till what?" "Till Thursday." Mason did the math in his head. "About 60 hours, give or take." Tommy nodded seriously, Like 60 hours was a number he could manage. He went back to watching the clock. Noon came and went. The call did not come. Mason refilled his coffee and sat with his phone face up on the table. Jake had left for a short shift at the hardware store, but told Mason to call him the moment anything changed. Tommy had moved from the couch to the front porch, sitting on the top step with his elbows on his knees. At 12:47, Mason's phone rang. He answered it on the second ring. It was not the patient coordinator. It was a man with a tired, careful voice who introduced himself as the administrative director of Clover Ridge. He said he was calling regarding Sarah Parker's discharge file. Mason sat up straight. "Is there a problem?" The man paused. "Mr. Cole, it appears that two documents critical to finalizing the release authorization are not present in our file. Specifically, the original emergency contact correction form and the updated insurance liability waiver. Without those two documents, we cannot legally process the discharge." Mason kept his voice even. "We submitted those weeks ago." "I understand that may be the case," the man said, "but they are not in our system, and they are not in the physical file. Until they can be located or resubmitted and re-verified, we have no choice but to suspend the release indefinitely." The word landed like something heavy dropped on a hard floor. Indefinitely. Mason stood up from the table. "What does indefinitely mean exactly?" "It means we cannot schedule or confirm any release date at this time," the man said. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. Our hands are tied." The call ended. Mason stood in the quiet kitchen with the phone in his hand. Through the front window he could see Tommy still sitting on the porch steps, watching the road, waiting for news he had no idea was already falling apart. Mason told them gently. He sat them both down at the kitchen table and used plain words and a steady voice and tried to keep his face calm while he explained what the administrative director had said. He told them about the two missing documents. He told them about the word indefinitely. He did not soften it too much because he knew they deserved the truth. Tommy listened without moving. Jake stared at the table. When Mason finished, the kitchen was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the wind pressing against the old windows. Tommy got up first. He did not say anything. He walked to the front door and carefully peeled the Welcome Home banner away from it. He folded it slowly, crease by crease, the way someone folds something they are not sure they will ever need again. He held it against his chest for a moment. Then he set it on the counter and went to his room and closed the door quietly behind him. The soft click of that latch was the worst sound Mason had heard in a long time. Jake pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling. His jaw was tight. His eyes were red at the corners but dry. He had gotten very good at keeping things inside, the way a boy does when he has been the strong one for too long. "How does this even happen?" Jake asked. His voice came out low and rough. "We did everything right, every form, every call, every deadline." He shook his head slowly. "Every single thing they asked for." "I know," Mason said. "So how does it just disappear?" Mason had no answer for that. He had been asking himself the same question since the phone call ended. Jake pushed back from the table and stood up. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark yard. His shoulders were pulled up near his ears, tight and exhausted. When he finally spoke again, his voice had gone flat in a way that was harder to hear than anger. "Maybe it just doesn't work out for us," Jake said. "Maybe that's just how it is." Mason wanted to argue. He opened his mouth to say something firm and sure, the kind of thing you say when you need someone to keep believing. But the words did not come, because standing in that dim kitchen, looking at the folded banner on the counter and the closed bedroom door, and the 19-year-old boy staring out the window like a man twice his age, Mason was not sure he believed it himself. He left shortly after. The night was cold and clear. Mason rode slowly, not heading anywhere at first, just moving because sitting still felt impossible. The streets of the town were quiet. Porch lights glowed yellow. Dogs barked from behind fences as he passed. He ended up at the gas station. The lights inside were off. A small lamp glowed in the back office where Edith sometimes did her bookkeeping late. The front door was unlocked. He had been there enough times that she always left it that way when she expected he might come. He pushed inside. The little bell above the door chimed once. He did not turn on the main lights. The glow from the lamp in the back was enough to see by. He walked to the counter and stood in front of the small frame that Edith had hung on the wall behind the register. The dollar bill inside looked small and ordinary under the glass, wrinkled and slightly yellowed at the edges. 2 words in a child's handwriting in blue pen. "Help me." Mason stood there for a long time with his arms crossed over his chest. The leather of his jacket creaked softly when he breathed. He had believed those 2 words meant something. He had believed he was the right person. He had believed that this time, the story was going to end differently than every other story he had ever been part of. Now he was not sure what he believed. The gas station was very quiet around him. Edith Simmons did not sleep well. She lay in bed listening to the ceiling fan turn slow circles above her and thought about Tommy's folded banner and Jake's flat voice and Mason's heavy boots walking out of the gas station the night before without saying a word. She thought about that small dollar bill behind the glass on the wall. She thought about 2 boys writing the same 2 words in the same place decades apart, and how that could not possibly mean nothing. At 4:37 in the morning, she stopped trying to sleep. She put on her robe and her slippers and went to the kitchen and made a pot of strong coffee. She sat at her small kitchen table with a yellow notepad and a pen and wrote down everything she knew. Names, dates, the name of the facility, the administrative director's name that Mason had mentioned over the past few weeks, the lawyer who had been helping part-time, the social worker who had stopped returning calls. She wrote it all down in her careful, looping handwriting. Then she picked up the phone. By 7 in the morning, she was already at the gas station. She flipped the sign to open out of habit, but left her part-time helper in charge of the register. She went straight to the back office and pulled open the bottom drawer of her old metal filing cabinet. Edith kept records of everything. People had teased her about it for years. She kept gas receipts from the 1990s. She kept handwritten delivery logs going back decades. She kept correspondence from county offices and state inspectors and vendors who no longer existed. Her children had begged her to throw it all away more than once. She was very glad she never listened to them. She started pulling folders and stacking them on the desk. The facility Sarah was in had originally been a county-supported care center before it transferred to private management about 8 years ago. Edith remembered that transition because it had caused problems for several families she knew. She had kept a newsletter about it. She had kept the contact information for the county liaison, who had overseen the transfer. She found his name at 9:15. Gerald Huff. He had retired 2 years after the transition. She called the number listed. It was disconnected. She tried the county office directly and was transferred 3 times before reaching a clerk who told her Gerald Huff had moved out of state. She asked for a forwarding contact. The clerk said she was not authorized to share that information. Edith thanked her politely and hung up and crossed his name off her list. She kept going. At 11 o'clock, she called Pastor Dean and asked him to reach out through his network of retired social workers. At 11:45, she called a woman named Lorraine Batts, who had worked as a records administrator for the county hospital system for 31 years and who owed Edith a favor going back to a very difficult winter in 2009. Lorraine listened carefully. Then she said she knew someone. "There was a woman who worked intake at that facility back when it was still county-run," Lorraine said. "Left on bad terms when the private company took over. She was not happy about the way they handled the patient transfer records. I remember because she came to me asking about filing a complaint." "Do you have her name?" Edith asked. "I do," Lorraine said. "Beverly Crane." Edith reached Beverly Crane at 1:30 in the afternoon. Beverly was quiet at first, cautious. She asked how Edith had gotten her number and what exactly this was about. Edith explained everything plainly and patiently, the way she did most things. She mentioned Sarah's name. She mentioned the error in the emergency contact forms. She mentioned the months that 2 boys had spent without their mother. The line was silent for a moment. Then Beverly said, "I kept copies." Edith sat up straight in her chair. "When they took over the facility," Beverly continued, her voice steady and deliberate, "they re-entered all the patient records into the new system manually. I flagged at least a dozen errors myself. Sarah Parker's file was one of them. I documented it. I have the original intake form, the corrected version they refused to file, and the email chain where I reported it to my supervisor and was told to leave it alone." The documents arrived by fax at the facility's administrative office at 8:17 in the morning. Edith had driven to Beverly Crane's house the evening before. Herself, in her old blue sedan with the cracked passenger mirror. She had driven 40 minutes down a county road she had not traveled in years, and sat at Beverly's kitchen table and gone through every page of every document Beverly had kept in a manila folder tucked inside a plastic storage bin in her hall closet. It was all there, every bit of it. The original intake form, with Sarah's correct emergency contact information. The email Beverly had sent to her supervisor flagging the error. The response telling her to move on. The corrected form that had never been filed. 8 months of proof sitting in a plastic bin in someone's hall closet while 2 boys ate canned soup and wondered if their mother had forgotten them. Edith made copies of everything at Beverly's kitchen printer. Then she called Pastor Dean. Then she called the lawyer who had been helping part-time. Then she called a reporter from the county paper who attended her church and had a good heart. By 8:30 that morning, the administrator's phone was ringing. By 9 o'clock, 3 different people had left messages. By 10:15, a county oversight official had been contacted directly. The administrator reviewed the documents for less than an hour. There was nothing left to argue. The error was clear. The documentation was clean. The coverage of the situation had already begun spreading, and the last thing the facility needed was a public story about a mother kept from her children because of a filing mistake that had been flagged and ignored. Sarah Parker's release was approved before noon. Mason found out from Jake, who called him with a shaking voice and could barely get the words out in the right order. Mason sat on his motorcycle in the parking lot of a hardware store and listened and did not say much. He looked down at the pavement and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and breathed slowly. "She's coming home," Jake said. "Mason? She's actually coming home." "Yeah," Mason said quietly. "She is." The gas station parking lot filled up on a bright Tuesday afternoon. People came without being asked. Edith had mentioned it to a few folks, and word moved through the town the way it always did, quickly and completely, touching every corner. Neighbors stood in small groups. Pastor Dean was there. Veterans who had ridden in the charity fundraiser leaned against their trucks. Families who had donated money or filled out forms or made phone calls stood together with their hands in their pockets, waiting. Tommy stood closest to the road. He was wearing a clean blue shirt that Jake had ironed that morning. His hands were clasped in front of him. His eyes did not move from the end of the parking lot entrance. Jake stood just behind him with one hand resting gently on Tommy's shoulder. When the white van turned off the main road and rolled slowly into the lot, Tommy went completely still. The van stopped. The side door opened. Sarah Parker stepped out. She was thinner than Tommy remembered. She moved carefully, one hand holding the doorframe for just a moment before letting go. Her hair was longer. Her eyes were searching. Then she found him. "Tommy," she said. It came out like a breath and a cry at the same time. Tommy ran. He crossed the distance between them in seconds and wrapped both arms around her and buried his face against her shoulder and held on. Sarah folded herself around him and pressed her lips to the top of his head and closed her eyes. She did not let go. Jake reached them seconds later, and his mother pulled him in with her other arm, and the three of them stood together in the middle of that parking lot while the crowd around them went completely quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Several people wiped their eyes without any embarrassment at all. It was the kind of moment that did not need words. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.